Does any one of you know what this is? Why would someone build a giant runway like this in the middle of nowhere in the Florida Everglades? Now, even if you know what this is about, I'm willing to bet that few of the details about this place and the way it's now being used will really surprise you. Stay tuned. Have you ever gone into Google Earth and just looked around and then randomly found something strange? Maybe some abandoned structure or old road that just doesn't seem to make any sense, that's just unexplainable. Well, it turns out that our world is actually filled with these type of things, which we just normally drive by without thinking much about them or maybe even noticing them. Most of the time they mean nothing, but sometimes they are the relics of an old and forgotten project that maybe looked really promising back in the day. Now, for a lot of different reasons, mainly to do with its vast open spaces and weather, Florida is dotted with a lot of quite unusual aviation related stuff that you can see clearly in satellite imagery. That includes of course the famous Kennedy Space Center. But there are also other complexes. If you look just to the east of Sebring, you will find something that looks alarmingly similar to a couple of old Soviet air bases, complete with aircraft on their runways, taxiways, and even some anti-aircraft SAM sites. These are obviously military target ranges used for training, and you can search for Avion Park Air Force Range on Google Earth if you want to go and see them. Just go slightly towards the north and southeast and you'll find them. But the site that I will talk about today doesn't actually have anything to do with any military project, at least as far as we know. This single runway sits in the Florida Everglades, about 70 kilometers or 45 miles away from downtown Miami, halfway between Miami and Naples in the west of Florida. There is no control tower at this airport, but that in itself isn't that strange because there are several airports without control towers in the United States, but I would hesitate to guess that there are very few with a paved 3,200 meter or 10,500 foot long runway. And that's not the only thing that this airport is missing. There are also no terminal buildings, no fuel or any permanent parking for aircraft of any size. There is an administration building, but definitely not the typical FBO that general aviation or corporate pilots might expect. Now, all of this might maybe lead some people to assume that this place isn't being used today at all, that it's just another curious relic, but that's actually not the case. It is in use today, and not just by the alligators in the swamps around it.
Go away!
You see, what this facility curiously does have is high intensity lighting for its enormous runway, medium intensity lighting for the parallel taxiway, and most importantly a published RNAV GPS approach for at least one of its two runways. In a way, the qualities of this site that continues to make it somewhat useful today are the same qualities that led to its creation almost 55 years ago. And to understand those, we have to travel back to what aviation looked like back in the 1950s and 60s. Today, when for example Boeing or Airbus decides to launch a new aircraft, the process and the time it takes to bring that design forward is enormous. That's because they have to start with hashing out the details of the design with potential customers and suppliers, and only after that can the actual development along with flight and certification testing really start. This means that the whole process can today take well over a decade to get a new design into the air. And because of that, it is really hard for us today to really understand the enormous speed with which aircraft were developed back in the middle of the last century. With so many new innovations coming after World War II and plenty of funding for aviation technology in the middle of the Cold War era, both military and commercial aircraft were being developed fast, and I mean really fast. Take the Boeing 727 for example. Boeing launched it back in 1960, the prototype flew in 1963, and it entered service less than 1 year later. That's only 4 years, and that was after some long delays and some indecision, mainly around engine choices, so it could have actually been pushed out even quicker than that. Aircraft development had to be that fast, or even faster, because of the sheer innovation speed back at that time. There were so much happening in terms of aerodynamics, materials and engine technology that some planes were becoming obsolete, sometimes just months after entering service, and therefore new models had to continuously be produced. I am at the moment covering some of the most iconic airliners, the real classics out there from that era, and I have a dedicated series about it on the channel that you can check out later. But there are just so many aircraft from back in the 1950s and 60s that were also wonderful, but for one reason or another just didn't really make it. Designs like the piston engine Martin 404 or the super sleek Convair 990, probably the fastest airliner that you've never heard of. The reason some of these old planes aren't better known today is because, if we use the Convair 990 as an example, it entered service in 1962, but the airline started replacing them only around 6 years later, so it never really had a time or chance to make a mark in history. Planes like the Convair were simply sometimes just overtaken by industry development, or they explored a development path that led down a blind alley, which never really led anywhere. Remember, this was back during an age when the airlines weren't even sure that jet engines would be the next hot thing, and because of that, wild ideas and concepts were happily thrown around and tested. I might actually come back and revisit some of these almost greats in later videos, but we're not going to do that today. The point here though is that because the pace of development and aircraft back then was so relentless, airline and airport bosses had to be really creative in order to predict what the needs of the aviation industry would be only a few years into the future. And that's where we arrived at the true purpose of this mystery airport and its enormous runway. But first, this. Boom! You just had the best business idea of your life. Maybe it's a new fantastic way to use AI, or maybe it's some kind of tech solution that will bring value to your company or customers. But how do you actually make it happen? Where do you start? This was exactly the problem I had when I wanted to start to create an app for nervous flyers and aviation enthusiasts out there, and the solution became Marco and his company CVT, creating value with tech. Together we have created a web app which gives access to news, an AI assistant called Aidan, flight information and much more. I have loved every second of working together with the team over at CVT because they didn't only give me solutions to my problems, but they were also guiding me on what features I should add and, more importantly, what not to add to the app. I would honestly recommend CVT to anyone who is serious about starting up a tech company or maybe is just looking for an awesome service provider for their existing employer. If you do contact them, let them know that it was me who sent you. And to get in contact with them, use the link here below, which is cvt.ai/mentor. That link will set you up to book a call with Marco and his team, and who knows, maybe this is the first step to making your lifelong entrepreneurial dream come true. Now, let's continue the video. The original name of this airport was supposedly the Everglades Jetport or Big Cypress Jetport according to some sources. But at the time of its inception, most people just referred to it as the new supersonic jetport, which might give you a bit of a clue to the reason it was created. That and the fact that construction of it began back in 1968 maybe gives you a hint of how its size and location would possibly make sense. Well, it should be said that its size today is only a fraction of what it was actually planned to be. If the build would have continued, this place would have actually become the world's largest commercial airport by far. So as you might have figured out by now, the Everglades Jetport takes us back to the supersonic aircraft development race, which started back in 1962 when the launch of the joint British and French Concorde was officially announced. When the Concorde announcement came, it actually caused widespread panic, particularly in the United States, who had comfortably been leading the way in aviation innovation up until that point. Now, even before the Concorde was announced, there had been a well-established belief that eventually all airliners, or at least the ones used for long haul, would be supersonic. Given the pace of progress in the industry at the time, this belief was completely logic, and thinking otherwise would have been quite absurd, to be honest. But the Americans had not been ready for someone else to take up the lead in the supersonic race, and because of that, very quickly the launch of an American Supersonic Transport, or SST for short, now suddenly got very high priority. And the US government even announced that this would be a publicly funded project, with the federal authorities picking the winner, something that was normally only done for military aircraft and virtually unheard of in the civilian side. The reason for this was likely because many in the administration at the time thought that the future of the US aviation industry and tens of thousands of American jobs were at stake. And to understand just how seriously the government took this, you need to listen to President John F. Kennedy's reaction from 1963 when Juan Trippe, who was running Pan Am at the time, announced that his airline would buy 6 Concords just a day before America's own SST contest was about to be announced. Something that Trippe apparently already knew about.
Didn't you have an understanding with him that he would waive? Yes. Well, now, will you give him this message from me and make it very clear that I think he ought to retract that, and he ought to wait now and see what the United States is going to do, or otherwise it's going to be very clear that Pan Am is contributing in a significant way to the United States being in a secondary position in the air and also to our balance of payment problem.
Now, Kennedy still went ahead with the competition for the American SST, and the idea was that the American version would not simply match the Concorde, it would completely eclipse it. The American variant would carry 300 passengers compared to the Concorde's 100, and it would cruise at Mach 3 instead of Mach 2. These specifications meant that this new jet would not only be supersonic, it would also need to be a twin-aisle design, at a time when no other twin aisles existed, not even conventional subsonic ones. And on January 1st, 1967, the FAA announced Boeing as the winner with its 2707 design. One reason Boeing won this race was because its design was the most optimistic out of the 3. But unlike Boeing, Lockheed and North American actually had gotten some real experience in designing supersonic jets, which made them much more conservative because they knew the challenges. Lockheed was at the time already making the all-titanium Mach 3 capable A-12 spy plane, which would soon evolve into the awesome SR-71 Blackbird. And North American was building the first XB-70 Valkyrie, a supersonic strategic bomber, which was another fantastic project that would eventually be cancelled after having flown only 2 prototypes. Because of this, once Boeing understood the magnitude of the challenges of this project, they would drastically redesign and scale down the 2707 to around 230 passengers and Mach 2.7 instead. These changes introduced long delays, but back in 1968, when the Everglades Jetport was announced, everyone still believed in the value and the future of this project. You see, another thing to remember here is that by the time Boeing won the SST competition, everyone had accepted that supersonic passenger jets would be, well, very, very noisy. Supersonic test flights had actually been conducted back in 1964 over Oklahoma City, both with small and large supersonic jets, just to gauge kind of what people thought about them. And it turned out that they weren't very positive, as you might imagine. But on top of the supersonic booms and the in-flight noise that the Boeing 2707 would create, there was also similar concerns about the noise they would generate around the airports. And if you're old and lucky enough to know what the Concorde actually sounded like on takeoff, you'll know that these concerns were quite justified. It basically sounded like the air was torn into shreds by the engines and the afterburners. It's cool. Now, it should be said here that in reality the Concorde was actually similar in noise levels near the airport to many of the early Boeing 707s at the time. And this was something that Concorde's operators would later point out. But remember, America's own 2707 was supposed to be much larger, with even more powerful and then, of course, noisy engines. Other SST entries, like Lockheed's for example, was predicted to be even noisier and require even longer runways, so airport designers had to assume that more supersonic jet designs would eventually follow, possibly with even more demanding specifications. The noise levels of these aircraft, plus the seemingly obvious conclusion that dozens of supersonic jets of different designs and noise levels could soon be operating from the airport daily, is what prompted the Dade County Port Authority in Florida to develop its supersonic jetport in the middle of nowhere. This airport wasn't intended to replace any existing airports in South Florida. On the contrary, the Everglades Jetport started being built just as the nearby Miami International Airport was actually being expanded. Instead, the idea behind the jetport was that it would operate as a strictly supersonic hub, connecting both international and domestic supersonic flights with other subsonic flights, and that would be achieved by fast rail or monorail links linking the jetport with, for example, Miami International Airport. And on top of that, there would also be trains, monorails and large highways for road traffic to multiple destinations within Florida. The location of the airport, right into what was then seen as just swampland, was seen as almost perfect, with limitless expansion potential. Its creators pointed out that even back then, in the late 1960s, other large hubs like JFK were already struggling to keep up with the need to expand, simply because of how close they were to large urban centers. By contrast, this site in the middle of the Everglades had enough space to fit the runways of JFK, LAX, San Francisco and Washington National combined if needed. It was simply enormous. Depending on the needs of its users, the Everglades jetport was planned to eventually have either 4 or 6 super long runways with plenty of room for more if that ever became necessary. And when I say super long runways, I don't mean the 3,200 meter runway that we can see there today. No, the plans called for 2 runways that would be 15,000 feet or 4,570 meters long, and that's incidentally more or less the length of the Space Shuttle landing facility, which you can find further up north in Florida. But these 2 runways would actually be the shorter ones. The plan was for the other 2 to be twice as long as that, measuring 30,000 feet or over 9 kilometers. It would actually be really interesting to know what sort of control tower that they had planned to use in order to monitor those runways. The other alternative plan was for the airport to have 4 additional runways, only as long as the first 2 were. All the runways would have the same east-west orientation, although there were also studies for some more complicated layouts. Another fact that made this position ideal for supersonic flights was the fact that South Florida was surrounded by water, which means that supersonic jets would be able to fly over water until just before their final approach. This would have allowed them to extend supersonic speeds as long as possible, optimizing their operations. But obviously, none of this ended up actually happening. Firstly, there were some really strong reactions against supersonic flights in general, which actually nearly killed the Concorde project and contributed to the eventual cancellation of Boeing's 2707. But when it came to the Everglades jetport specifically, quite a lot of people took strong issue with the description of its site as mere useless swampland. A government inquiry into the plan to build the airport was ordered by US Secretary of the Interior Walter Hickel back in 1969. And that report indicated that the necessary plans to drain large swaths of the land needed to create the airport would completely destroy the present ecosystem in the Everglades National Park and also severely damage other wildlife and preservation areas in South Florida. The US government, then run by Nixon, accepted the result of these reports, opposing the construction and funding of the Everglades jetport. Only 1 runway was eventually completed, and that's the runway that you can see on Google Earth today. But here is where this story has one final twist. I'm sure that many of you have guessed that this airport is now being used for practice and training purposes, given its surprisingly good runway facilities and, well, the lack of anything else there. Its official name today is the Dade Collier Training and Transition Airport, and it's using the somewhat worrying IATA identifier TNT. But a key detail that many people who already knew this place's history probably don't know is that the transition into this role of a training and transition airport wasn't actually a transition. It actually happened by design. When they launched the project, the Dade County Port Authority also managed the Miami International Airport, and they claimed that as much as 42% of the existing Miami traffic involved training and transition flights by commercial aircraft. At the time, this amounted to between 160,000 and 200,000 movements per year. That's an insane number, and it probably had to do mainly with South Florida's good weather compared to other US airports. But we must also remember that we are talking about the late 1960s, when the best full-flight simulators weren't even close to what we have today. This meant that back then, flight crews had to spend many more hours training in actual jets. This was obviously a role that this new jetport could fulfill immediately, lifting the training and transition burden off Miami International's shoulders. Using the new runway this way would immediately increase Miami International's effective capacity, and the authority would still be able to collect landing fees for the training flights at this new airport. That is actually the reason why this runway was finished, even after all the objections to the full-scale airport, and it's why it continues to exist and operate today. The good Florida weather still makes it a perfect choice for training flights, and by the way, the Concorde actually ended up flying regularly in and out of Miami International for several years during the mid-1980s, so the noise problem couldn't have been that bad as they first predicted. Obviously, better simulators have today made the TNT runway less important. It used to have an ILS approach and other nav aids active, but I guess these were harder to maintain than an RNAV is. Airlines and even flight schools can still use the airport for training, provided that they pay a fee, and general aviation pilots can fly there for free, but only if they have the right permits from Dade County Port Authority. There are now plans to use this airport for testing of urban air mobility or eVTOL aircraft, and again, good weather and a great big runway and a lot of distance from houses and people can be really useful for a lot of things, provided that you don't get eaten by an alligator, that is. Now, I hope that you really liked this video, and if you did, leave a comment, like and subscribe. Now, check out these videos next, and if you want to support my work, then consider buying a t-shirt or joining my fantastic Patreon crew. There are links to everything here in the description below. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!